Welcome to Business Model Hackers. This is a podcast where we unravel the complexity of business and management tools. Sam Schreim, who will be leading this discussion, is a former top-tier management consultant who traded in the security of a lucrative career for a dynamic world of entrepreneurship. And this podcast you're listening to is part of that journey. Today, we're going to be diving into the 4 disciplines of execution, also known as 4DX. Sam Schreim, you should know, brings a huge wealth of experience. Just so you know, he's advised everyone from Fortune 500 executives to ambitious startups. It even extends into sharing expertise with governments and nonprofits in strategic and management roles. So gear up as we dissect this. Let's hack. Okay, Sam, how are you doing?
Good, Philip. How are you today?
I'm feeling great. I think we have a pretty nice episode lined up for people. Something that they may be familiar with, may not be familiar with. But I know, as usual, you're going to give us the textbook and then the business model hacker way. And that's why people come to the show. So if you don't mind, I'd like to kick things off with a question about the 4 disciplines of execution. With how do these 4 disciplines of execution help organizations balance their day-to-day operations with long-term strategic goals?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. But before we dive into this, I just want to say a few things. Actually, I'm glad you brought this topic today. And it's one of the cognitive tools that I have in my cognitive toolset. I want to say a few words on the importance of differentiating between what I call buzzwords and brands and actual long-tested and proven management tools, right? There is this thing about like 4DX and 7 habits, and there's like the things they call tools that even in my book, right? The Eisenhower matrix and the 2x2 matrix BCG. So these are like branded names, right? They're branded names to remember, to kind of have something to refer to. Oh, okay, I remember. If I think of that, I remember that. However, I mean, the 4DX specifically is actually trademarked and has been registered, but it's a concept that is not new, right? It's something that's been in place for several decades, been used, and we'll get into that in this episode. I'll explain why. The reason I include the branded tools in my cognitive toolset is because I want people, and I want the readers and the business model hackers out there to know all of the available tools out there, right? I don't want them to hear something and say, what is that? I remember when I had first graduated from college and I got my first job, right? And it was General Electric at the time. I was a management trainee, and I first heard the word like things like 6 Sigma black belts, right? I mean, like, I was like, what? Statistics and martial arts? That's like the first thing that came to mind. But really, I didn't know what the heck this is. Ideally, I would have known. Oh, okay, we're talking about management, right? Not statistics, right? I mean, like, these are like specific tools that apply in different places, etc. So the nice thing about knowing all of that is actually you can then sort through the BS and the actual working proven models, and it's very important you understand what's out there, as a gimmick, nomenclature, and a brand, as an actual branded new product, right? Like, I have a lot of respect, for example, for Bain, the Bain & Company. They do a lot of branded products, but they're really innovative, right? So they really create stuff that is very innovative. And whenever they really go and trademark something, it is because it's truly new, right? It's not because it's like some aggregation of other stuff. It's almost like, taking the Bible and rewriting, some of the words and saying, well, branding it as the new Bible, right? This is how these brands are. Whereas, if you have a really good new invention on a tool, I think that's what you should brand it. Nonetheless, because those are common tools. I mean, what I gathered in my book and in the toolset, the cognitive toolset, should be comprehensive of everything that's commonly used, like that people, refer to in the business world or in management. So that somebody throws a word like that, 4DX, oh, okay, we're referring to this thing. Now, what is 40X? 40X was really invented and trademarked by Sean Covey. He's an executive and the son of the late author Stephen Covey. His father wrote the famous best-selling book that, I don't know, they sold 20 million copies worldwide, called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The thing is with the 40X itself, right? And the reason it resonates with a lot of people, and the reason I think all these concepts, like the Eisenhower, the 2x2, they resonate with people because of their simplicity, right? And it's nice. I believe in keep it simple, right? thing. But I also believe that you shouldn't always confine yourself to like the simple stuff. I mean, sometimes the solution to a problem is more complex. It's not always simple, right? So you have to look, and people don't like complexity, right? They don't like to have, but if you know all of the tools out there, you should be able to use them almost, or having like think about it like almost like a Swiss Army knife, right? If you come up with a problem, you're faced with problem. If you only know 1 or 2 or 3 tools, you're gonna say, okay, but this doesn't fit in my tools. You try to fit them, and that's the thing about Six Sigma. Like they came up with Six Sigma initially in manufacturing, and then they tried to fit it everywhere, right? It doesn't really work everywhere. It's not good. So the idea is like you really need to look at, what is the best tool for the situation, and not take the tool and fit it to every situation. I think that's the mistake that we want to avoid before we dive into these things. I mean, what are these 4 things that they're talking about? I mean, and the reason, by the way, there's this thing about memory, about the 4 things, right? I mean, people can remember 4 things. Right? They think about it like if I give you 4 digits, you can probably recite them after our episode. But if I give you 5 digits, it becomes more difficult. And the 3 digits is even easier, right? But anything between 3 and 4, people can retain. Okay. And that's why 40X, I believe, and that's why it really resonated with a lot of people. So, and the bottom line is that evolves around everything in business today, if you think about it, is about a large organization, is made out of programs, right? And initiatives, okay? Strategies, business plans, all of them, right? They're implementation, or they're an outline of a bunch of initiatives and goals and objectives, right? That's what they are. Not setting the strategy, but when you have a strategy document or business plan, it really talks, we're going to do 1, 2, 3. Now, the second bit of this is executing those initiatives. So group them together. You can think of them almost as a program, right? I had my fair share of managing programs, my career. If you've ever managed a team, you must have come across, deliverable of some form, right? So programs always have a deliverable. So the idea here, those 4 things, they boil down to focus. The first one they call focus, right? And the idea of focus for them is basically your ultimate goal. Your ultimate goal, they call the first discipline of 40X. The ultimate goal could be anything like, okay, I want to increase revenue, right? That could be your goal, right? The ultimate goal. So you focus on that. The second one is your KPIs, and that's what they call measure, right? So KPIs, it's another common thing. The first one is goals, right? So you can have multiple goals, but they say focus on the one goal. So you try to group them all together, put them in one goal, and all the other things are sub goals under that goal. The second one is like the KPIs, and they call this measure. So in KPIs, you have leading and lagging KPIs, right? So it's the famous thing among KPIs. So they also have leading and lagging KPIs, right? So then the third thing is what they call a compelling scoreboard, right? Well, but that is actually a balanced scorecard. So if you've ever managed a program, those are like essential. So you have your initiatives, you have your KPIs, you have your balanced scorecard to measure. And lastly, they have something they call cadence of accountability. I mean, that's like basically your accountability and your rewards mechanism. So that's the fundamentals of project management. Okay, they kind of summarize them and dump them into 4X. So it's, nothing else but project management. So you try to fit everything into it. Really, I don't know. But it's, if you really study for the 4DX, or you look into it and you dive deeper into it, you need to understand how to do those 4 things very well. I mean, each one of those, how to set KPIs, is like something that you have to learn in of its own. The balance scorecard, how to set it up also. Your goals, strategic goals and objectives, okay, that lead to the ultimate goal. That's also your true north. That's another thing. You can basically, instead of retaining these buzzwords that they have, just think about them as goals, KPIs, balance scorecard, and rewards, like your rewards and accountability mechanisms. So I think that's easier. But they had to create these new buzz terms that people will remember. I don't mean to diminish the 40X by any means. No, there's some merit to using it as, if that helps people retain and run. I think the Kobe's have done a brilliantly in terms of, popularizing the brand from textbook to management tools to making these accessible to the general public. You don't have to have a degree in an MBA from an elite university to understand that. So I think that's, that's remarkable that they've been able to do that. But I think what's important, that you need to know all the tools at your disposal. When you're executing something, you face something, you need to, for example, right, you need to understand the difference between, this kind of project management or execution or implementation versus, agile implementation and lean, right? You need to understand that there are these other things also, and they also work, right? So it's not enough to just learn one thing and stick to it and say, this is the only thing that works, right? So that's, I think, what's important here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. When I remember actually coming across the book really early, I wasn't even involved in business at all to any capacity. I was always an avid reader. And I remember reading this book and thinking to myself, oh, okay, so this is what the business world is like. But I like that you're saying, yes, they may or may not actually use 4DX in everyday nomenclature, but the concepts that they've been able to package together, they can be used. They are some of the tools that you should be expected to be familiar with in some capacity by any name. It just so happens that it's 4DX in this particular case. And yeah, kind of back to the story you shared, the last thing you want to do is walk into a room and they're talking about 4DX and you're like, what is this, a video game? What are we talking? Is this a sports team? What's going on right now? So if that is the case though, can you give a real world example of an organization that's actually used 4DX to transform their operations?
Well, I mean, I don't know specifically of 40X, people using 40, but I would tell you that almost every organization I've worked with has, those four things that I told you in place. I think every organized organization, let's say, right? Even in the agile world, right? You can't be agile and not have, targets or have some measures that you want to, achieve at the end of the day. I think by the way, there is the agile school where they're agile everything. We don't have targets. And I don't subscribe to that school. You really need to have targets. You can change them. It doesn't mean they're cast in stone. Of course, if you come across something that requires the change, adaptability is super important, right? But the idea of having an initiative or a program with set targets, with set KPIs, and with the balance KPIs that translate to actual frequency and targets that you want to reach, and how often you measure that, and how you're doing against it, etc. All of that, is super important. Now, I think it's, it's much easier rather than going and studying the 40X or whatever. It's better to go learn how to develop KPIs, which is a simple thing, right? I mean, you start with the goals, and then you go with your vision, mission, and make sure you align to your vision and goal, and you come back with the individual strategic objectives, and based on your strategic objectives, you identify your goals, and based on your goals, you say, okay, how can I measure that? What are the goals? What are my targets for the goals? And how frequently should I measure it? And then, there are also the four categories and KPIs. So I think it's, a little bit more, if you learn the KPIs of how to set them up, which are like financial, the learning and operations and customer, those four core elements of KPIs, you learn that it's far easier to learn. You can grab a book on that, or you can grab one of my books or one of my tools that you can download on our website, and you could read through it, and it's very simple of how to really develop KPIs. And the same thing goes with the balanced scorecard, which is Now, implementing that though in a dashboard, depending on your size organizations, you could automate it. If you have a very large organization, you could have an ERP where it requires development, or you could be a small shop or a team doing stuff that you can actually do it in an Excel spreadsheet, which is easier. So it really depends on the depth of the organization and which level you're looking at. So if you're looking at a very hierarchical and a very complex organization, the CEO will have the dashboard where, the CEO can then ideally dig into each KPI and see, for example, if a KPI is missed, the reason it was missed, and if you're down at the team level, you can do it just in an Excel spreadsheet. And there are also softwares that implement that, on the balanced scorecard front. But it's an exercise that is difficult to do internally unless you have a department. So ideally, you would retain some consultants to do it for you regardless. But you do need to understand, I'm a firm believer that no matter what level you are in the organization, if you're implementing something or bringing the expert, you got to at least understand, how that's done, okay? Because you want to make sure ultimately it's done correctly, even if you have the expert doing it. Yeah, remember, when you bring in an expert to your organization, they don't really know how your organization runs. You'll have the knowledge internally, right? You've been in the company or in your organization long enough to be able to provide the feedback and make sure that whatever they're implementing is, aligned with what you need, because consultants aren't there. They have the problem with consultants is they have no skin in the game. I love that book from Nassim Taleb, Skin in the Game. I don't know if you read that one.
It's on my to-do list, yeah.
Yeah, it's super interesting. The consultants are paid no matter what, right? And they come in, they do their work, and they leave, right? The problem is also with consultants, they're reverse incentivized. So incentives aren't aligned. They're not incentivized to fix your work, right? They're incentivized to find more problems. Because the problem is fixed, they're done. They can't get paid, and they can't get paid more, right? So, the job is done, they have to leave, right? That's another ethical thing, obviously, but it's something that you need to understand about consultants and the way the incentives are misaligned. And you want to make sure that ultimately what they do, because they have no skin in the game, is really addressing your needs. And for that, I think understanding all the tools, like I said, again, the Swiss Army knife, approach, understanding all those tools and knowing how they work, at least, you don't need to go and deep dive into doing it or doing it yourself. I mean, yes, great if you can do it yourself. Maybe you can do a small exercise here and there in a case study, but understanding how that's done will help you ultimately, even when you bring the expert to do it for you, you make sure they do it right? I think that's what's important.
Yeah, no, 100%. And again, just like the first of all, the awareness that these things are out there, great. This is also an invitation to look deeper into it. Make sure you understand and you place a lot of emphasis on the idea of a KPI and how those are designed. And we have plenty of resources that we can share with people to look further into those things. 100% true, right? Then there's this concept that you talked about with focus, right? Which was one of the more initial things. And you were talking about goals and the subset of goals. And I think one of the phrases they used in 40X, if I remember correctly, was this idea of wildly important goals, which I always make it akin to another term I've heard thrown around, and maybe we'll get into it one day, called the BHAG, right? The big, hairy, audacious goal. And so how does it change an organization when they have this approach to goal setting versus an achievement versus we have priorities?
Yeah, I mean, priorities is actually that, right? I mean, we have priorities, yes. You have to know your priority. The topic of priorities is a complex one, right? I mean, personally, the way I would look at priorities is sometimes, first of all, there's the 80-20 rule, something we've discussed in another episode. That's something super important, the 80-20, where 20%. I think if you go and we talked about how 80-20 is recursive, 150 goes down to 150. So less than 1% can tackle 50%, can be as important as 50% of your issues, right? From a priority perspective, if you start with that 1%, the one thing, that can tackle 50%. And then you go up from there, and go up to the second level, right? Then you have 4 things that are 2/3 of the stuff, etc. So that will help you establish kind of a line of priorities, and that would help you establish kind of the focus. But I think more important than focus on one, right, is to have a proper true north and a north pole, right? This is established in a way, in a vision and a mission, right? The vision and your aspiration. So you set that, that's very broad, right? At some point it's broad, but it could have one goal, right? The vision could be around one goal. Like Microsoft back in the 90s, their goal was to put one computer on every desk, right?
Yeah.
On every household. So that's one goal. That's their aim, right? Now, if that's your goal, that's an example of how you can set that priority, right? You can combine all of your other things into that. Ultimately, you can't work on just the one thing. And like if we looked at the leading and lagging, that's a lagging KPI. You can't influence that thing. You have to do other stuff that influence this thing. So those initiatives that you're taking are still there. It doesn't mean I'm going to take one initiative and ignore all the other initiatives. I don't think that's how they mean implementation of 40X is, right, in the focus. Because you have to run all of these. And there is something we call critical path. If you're into project management, the critical path. You want to make sure that critical path is always on time. It's always, that one is the one that you're always observing. But you also do scenario modeling, where, for example, what happens if one of these other, if that kind of falls back, or we have to change course or something, what happens in that? So when you do these scenario modeling, you're able to then tackle or set up what we call a risk abatement plan, right? So there's something called known risks and unknown risks. That's the thing about project management. Like, something I didn't see, by the way, in the 40X, maybe it's there somewhere, but the idea of having identifiable risks and unknown risks. How do you tackle unknown risks, the unknown? When that happens, what are you going to do, right? So you need to have a plan for that, not knowing, right? Having a plan of, okay, so this happens, what do we do? We convene, we do this and that. Okay, you need to have an action plan at least for that. And you need to know the known risks. The known risks are something you can identify. And those you will set up and have an abatement plan. How you're going to make sure when that happens, first of all, what are the actions you're going to take to minimize that risk? That's number one. Number two, what happens when that happens? So you have to have both of these in place as you go ahead and implement the plan. I think, back in the days I mentioned, when I worked at GE, it was, I worked in a department called New Product Introduction. And it was a new thing back then, right? And they had, every new product that has been, it's not the R&D department. It's not where, the PhDs come sit down and research stuff, right? It's not the research. It's actually implementing and developing products and launching it to the market. So either take an existing product, revamping it, and, launching the second phase, or it's doing a new product, right? Developing a new product and launching it to the market. So, my team was always on time, even in complex projects, and the other teams were always lagging. I think the only problem is that, and this is why actually I left managing people. I was very harsh on, I was a very tough leader on the team. So whenever that critical path was missed in some way, we always put in the extra time. I always pushed the team as hard as possible to kind of bring that back to, put it back on course. That was one of the things that, always helped me always deliver on time and on budget, right? I mean, the problem was on budget is that I couldn't add more people into this because I don't have budget to do that. So we had to work overtime to get it done. And, that's kind of a passion in me. If I have a goal, I shoot for it. And, later on, even in consulting, we have sometimes, 8 weeks to deliver programs. And I'm harsh, when people don't perform, or when we have some deadline to meet and, people don't want to put in the extra time. Nowadays, I think it's more difficult to do that. But if you have constraints in terms of being able to make up for lost time, then you really need to build in contingency and extend your timeline. I think a lot of problems in executing, programs or executing plans is that always optimistic, always. I would tell you like 100% optimistic. I've never seen a plan that's relaxed. Never, ever. Human beings are always optimistic, and you always set a plan that's aggressive and unreasonable to achieve. So if you don't have the ability to throw in people and resources and money to offset the lost time on the critical path, you should be extending and adding contingency to your plan. Right. That's, my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I always go back to marketing just because that's like the core of my skill set. But it's the same thing when you're onboarding a client and, they set these crazy goals and they're like, we're going to be for everybody. Well, first, you can't be for everybody, right? Like there should be a subset that you're specifically focused on first. We're going to achieve as many people as possible, but we need to have some degree of that. And then, it's about pushing the whole team to ensure that, like if it's an e-commerce brand, right, that there's nothing in the way, no bottleneck in the process of that. And you're right, we only have so much budget to run ads, and then what does that look like, right? Like have we run out of ads, and then we ran out of the ad budget and the conversions of the clicks aren't there, right? And it's like, well, what happened? Well, now we still have to make those sales goals that were crazy. And so now it's like, can we revise that? Can we renegotiate it? So a lot of what you're saying when you're talking to me about these things, I'm just like, yeah, I see how these apply in the strategic world, in the corporate world, in team building and with scorecards. A lot of these concepts are just amalgamating in my head. And so I just felt like I had to share maybe one other perspective, just how I'm interpreting a lot of this to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. With that said,
yes, you are. Good point.
You brought up a super interesting idea of the leading indicators and the lagging indicators as far as measurement points. I think that wraps up our discussion for today. And I just want to say again, a thank you to the listeners for tuning into the Business Model Hackers podcast. If you're looking for more insights and more updates, please visit businessmodelhackers.com. And, there's an invitation extended to you. We do have a newsletter there. When you sign up to it and you subscribe to what we're doing on the website, we go even deeper and far more in depth on these tools that we're discussing here. Thank you so much for tuning in, and let's keep hacking.